All right, so we're back. Again, we're going to pick up, and remember, the objective here tonight is to better understand how to be equipped so that you can do the work of the ministry as a missionary with different categories of lostness, how you can become more effective as an ambassador of Christ within the context of being the aroma of Christ into the nostrils of those whom you might not naturally find yourself fitting with, or those whose questions and concerns and doubts, the insulation that separates them from God, might not be what you're most naturally gifted to address, or might not be most passionately excited about addressing. But here's the thing, if you're a lifeguard and you've got people drowning on your section of the beach, do you go around deciding which ones? Well, I'm sorry, I only rescue boys under the age of 12 and only up to this weight class. Or, I'm sorry, no, I don't deal with the saving of drowning people within your ethnicity. Or, I'm sorry, no, you're an intellectual drowning person. No, I'm sorry, I don't rescue intellectuals. As ridiculous as that would sound if we were talking about lifeguards, I pray that you understand it would be ridiculous if it were not more offensive to speak of it spiritually. And my goal tonight is to better equip all of us to serve on the spiritual beach that God gives us as lifeguards, and to recognize that there are a lot of people all around us all the time who are drowning, who are dying spiritually. In many cases because people will not engage them in their context, in their culture, and meet them where they are. My prayer is that we'll be better equipped through this time tonight. Let's go ahead and take a look at another conversation, this one focusing on the basic question of who do you think you are? Who are you as a Christian to say? Let's watch 3 more conversations and then we'll go ahead and take another break about an hour from now.
So, welcome back for our third discussion together on the reason for God. We're talking about issues that make Christianity untenable for many, many people. And our topic for tonight, let me read it, sounds like this. What gives you the right to tell me how to live my life? Why are there so many rules? Let me flesh that out. Christianity is often seen as an enemy of freedom, of authentic personhood, social cohesion, because it appears that Christians are telling everybody else how they ought to live their lives instead of giving them the right to decide what is right or wrong for them. There was a philosopher, Diderot, who had a very quaint little saying. He said, "There will be no freedom until the last king is strangled on the entrails of the last priest." And I'm hoping nobody here takes that literally for my own sake. But he's saying it in a very startling way, but his main point is that religion is as much an enemy of freedom as totalitarianism. See, in other words, a king is as bad as a priest. What do you think? I mean, I know that's overstatement, but do you think that Christian moral claims are an impediment to freedom? What do you think?
No, because a king has absolute power when a priest has barriers to power.
I think my problem is, like, I'm not exactly sure what freedom means. This sounds like an Eddie question, but I think it's difficult for me to understand what the rules actually are.
Isn't that what psychotherapy is about, though? Breaking rules that we've made for ourselves that are unsuccessful. We ask ourselves why our life isn't working out.
And just to add on that, it seems like a lot of it is actually just human interpretation. Like, what is actually solid foundation, what the actual beliefs are, and what is interpretation by, I guess, humans as to what they actually think it is. So it comes down to that, I think.
Yeah, but I think his original question is like, who tells you how to live your life? And with the Constitution as like a government, whether it's a king or a president, it's something that can be changed, something that people can express their need to be amended. And with the Bible, there's really not that option. I feel like everybody has rules, and I believe that whether your parents give them to you, or a pastor or a priest or a teacher or a babysitter or a brother or a sister or an employer, everybody will give you rules. But it doesn't matter. If the only way that you will follow those rules is if you respect the person that's giving them to you.
This question is very interesting. The question is, who gives you the right to tell me how to live my life, and why are there so many rules? I think we're talking about within a Christian framework, and I think I'd like to sort of go up in altitude a little bit, because I think that's a good sort of question that someone who's not of the faith can talk about. I believe there are, every moment in our life, we're following someone's rules, period. It's not sort of biblical. We follow parent rules, we follow economic policy. Those are ways that rules are enforced. So we can't really escape it. It's just a matter of being conscious of knowing whose rules we're following. And then that said, I think structure or rules, I sort of equate the two, are necessary for freedom. I think there's actually, we can have, it's called an abyss of liberty, where there's too much freedom, and then you become paralyzed because there's too many options. So I think freedom and rules actually are one and the same. I think you need both. You can't have one without the other.
Actually, I think Eddie's made two statements. I'd love to hear you out on with them. The first one is that everybody does have rules. Everybody does make a decision about what is right and wrong, and then you feel like you ought to follow them. They are rules for you. You feel a sense of obligation, and you can't just shrug them off. And so you, I think, are saying that it's not just Christians, and it's not even just religious people, but actually everybody comes up with a decision about what is right and what is wrong, feels obligated, and therefore everybody's working off rules.
And I think they exist. Whether they're explicit or not,
Yes.
is another question.
What do the rest of you think?
All rules are self-imposed at some level. I mean, you have to take responsibility for what you're going to follow. But of all the things that Eddie was saying, even going to sleep, we have to follow these things that are self-generated.
And not just self-generated. I mean, I've got young kids, so we're busy imposing rules every day.
That's right. That's right.
And the rules are empowering in the sense of if they didn't follow the rules, for example, they wouldn't have friends. If they didn't follow the rules, they wouldn't be able to go to school. If they didn't follow the rules, they wouldn't be able to go out by themselves, basically. So we're teaching them rules that help them. So now a lot of what we're teaching them is borrowed from the Bible. Even if we're not, Christians, it's still borrowed from the Bible. It's in relationship to the Constitution. It's in relationship to a lot of other unspoken rules or socialization. One of the things is when you talk to somebody, you look in their eye. I'm not sure it's in the Bible, but it's in sort of the sort of cultural thing that we should, we teach them, basically.
Within your culture, though.
Within our culture,
That's
exactly.
actually not in my culture. It's
Yeah.
actually
I know.
threatening to look in the eye a little bit. Actually.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think I resist that, the idea that there is some higher authority that knows everything. I don't necessarily resist the idea that there are rules that I can follow or should follow or would be better for me to follow. I have a lot of trouble, however, with the idea that they are written down somewhere, that they are, in a book that's 2,000 years old or however many thousand years old it is, and that, it's sort of doing that or damnation, that kind of thing.
I think life at every moment presents us with these moments that we sort of start creating rules, or we articulate rules around something like thou shalt not kill thy neighbor or covet thy neighbor's wife, or a lot of neighbor stuff. And then what happens is they become sort of, we have to transfer these best learning practices, best life practices to our children, and then they become, rules. They become very short, simple rules. And I think that's what happens. And in the Bible, I think, was a moment in time where instead of just sort of passing it down to your children, we decided to make an attempt to codify it in stories and such. And there are a lot of other religions that have done the same. Mm-hmm. So that's where I think this the meeting point is about rules and structure and religion come together.
An example I often like to use is if I eat whatever I want to eat, then I will have terrible health and maybe die in my 40s from a heart attack. If I restrict myself because my body needs certain kinds of food, that is, I'm limiting myself, and even though it's hard in the short run, in the long run, I thrive and I live a longer time and I can do more things. Or exercise. In exercise, I don't like to do exercise because it's very hard work, but in the long run, if I do it, I feel better. And so would it not be, therefore, the case that morally, it's hard to forgive, it's hard to sometimes show respect when you don't want to, it's hard to refrain from certain things, but in the long run, there's more freedom if we refrain. And therefore, by limiting yourself and submitting to some rules, it actually creates freedom instead of diminishing it.
You know, there's certain rules associated with Christianity that I don't object to. I think they're beneficial. Most of the 10 Commandments, I think, fall into that category. I think what I'm primarily concerned with and really curious about are the rules that are served to ostracize others and to demonize others.
I think the deepest value being honored in all of this is still the value of reciprocity. I mean, that's kind of where it all comes from. Like, if all of us have it, because if we didn't, there would be no morality or rules. If you don't believe that we all should have the similar rules apply to us, none of this works. So we all kind of come from there, and therefore, like, a genocide notion won't work because, you know, we don't want it done on us, so we're not going to do it onto them. That's sort of the foundation for me.
But you would say it's wrong, not just impractical. Genocide.
Yeah, I mean, maybe your point. Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. That makes sense.
Our passion with following that might come from some underlying feeling of sacredness. I mean, it's just not that it is, you know, the reciprocity. I have to experience some form of genocide to form an opinion about it. I have this overwhelmingly passionate feeling that any life should be protected if I can step in.
Right.
And where did that come from? I don't know where that comes from. I think it's impossible to avoid not observing rules in any part of your life. Stravinsky, who's a huge influence on me, always said that he felt most free when he had rules in his own life. I think that if there are rules, at some point, no matter what anyone says, we end up adopting them as our own. So I don't really know if I believe in externally imposed rules.
So I had a question. What is the Christian view of homosexuality?
There's three things that Christians say, I think, that have to do with homosexuality. First of all, the Good Samaritan parable, and the very model of Jesus dying for people who were opposing him, means that all Christians are duty-bound to love and serve their neighbors, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of whether they're people of other faiths, people with different views of sexuality. We are supposed to make this city a great place for everybody to live in regardless of their beliefs. That's important. In other words, we have to love people regardless of where they are on that spectrum of belief. Secondly, the gospel of Christianity, which is that you're saved not by good doctrine, not by your good works, but by sheer unmerited grace. It pulls out the self-righteousness and the superiority that tends to go along with religious belief, which has actually made a lot of gay people suffer. A lot of gay people have suffered under that kind of attitude, and I think the gospel takes that away from us, and that is good for gay people. Thirdly, when the Bible tells us something about how we should live, like sex, money, power, it always does it like this. It says, God created us, and therefore God in His Word in the Bible is giving you directions for how you should live in accord with your own design. It's not busy work. It's like when the owner's manual comes to a car, it says, change the oil every so many thousand miles. It's not busy work. It's saying that's how the car was designed. You know, if you violate that, you're actually hurting the car. So the Bible does say sex is for a man and a woman inside marriage to nurture love and commitment in a long-term permanent relationship of marriage, which means polygamy, it means sex outside marriage, and it means homosexuality are considered violations of God's will, but also violations of our own design. So the Bible is actually saying you're missing out if you do those things. So the Christian view of homosexuality is you're going against your own design and you're actually missing out on God's best for you.
I believe there's some rules or stories that basically object or think that homosexuality is a sin. I think that might be a rule in spirit, was trying to be helpful, but I think played out in contemporary society can be very problematic. More problematic in the sense that because it's stated in the Bible, discussion ends about it. It's just that's what the Bible says. And I think that is the more damaging dynamic that results from Bible rules, I would say.
Let me make a proposal. One of the problems I think that we often run into is that we, from the outside, that is, if you're not a kind of an inside Christian believer, it's a little hard to understand how rules actually function inside Christian faith. They actually don't operate the same way that rules and moral rules operate in other philosophical systems and religious systems like this. Traditional religion says, if I obey the rules, then God accepts me. Whereas Christianity says that because I believe in Christ, who has done everything for me, he's died in my place and so on, I'm accepted, and therefore I obey the rules. Okay, so one approach is, I obey the rules, then God accepts me. The Christian idea is, even though I'm not good enough, God has saved me, he's forgiven me through Jesus, and therefore I'm accepted, and then I obey the rules. God accepts me because of Jesus, when I believe in him, and then I obey the rules. Now think about this, how different this is. Two people, a religious person in this sense, and a Christian, could be sitting there next to each other. They both could be giving their money to the poor, telling the truth, raising their children, doing this, but for totally different reasons. Because the religious person is doing it largely in order to get something from God, and also, if he's doing it, he feels pretty good about it, like, hey, I'm a pretty good person. A Christian person is doing it just to find a way to love the God who saved him. And so, for Christians, the rules is not at the center. For a more traditional religious person, the rules are the center. It's what makes me what I am. To me, that difference is enormous. I wouldn't even be a minister if I didn't believe in that difference. And I do everything I can to pull people off of the first approach to rules into the second approach. Now, is that clarifying to you? Does that help in any way?
Just throw out something that to help me understand. I'm trying to understand the dichotomy that you presented. In a sense, what I'm hearing is acceptance of Jesus and God within the Christian paradigm that you've articulated is tantamount to the love that a parent has for the child. It's unconditional. It's just there. The child doesn't have to work through its lifetime to earn it. It's just there.
Right.
Versus a love that a friend could have for another friend, where in some senses you have to earn it, you can fall in and out of it.
Yes.
But it's just there, it's done, and then the idea is if that's the mentality, the mindset, the space, the actions will follow accordingly, but you just never lose that. It's just there.
Occasionally, God is called a friend, but usually he's called Father.
I can understand that.
I don't like rules where I'm just told to do something because. So, like, I actually experienced this a lot growing up, where, say, my parents would be like, do this. Like, they would order me to, like, you have to go clean your room. I would say, why? Because I said so. And that kind of circular reasoning for me, it doesn't hit home. I really need a logical reason for doing this. Like, if they had explained the reason why I should clean my room, like, okay, well, it's more hygienic, it's a good habit to develop. If you ever want a girlfriend or anything, you're going to need a clean room. All those things, like, the meaning behind it is important to me. I think at one point in my life, I was much more stubborn also at acknowledging the need for rules. I hated being told to do something, but I think at this point in my life, I've come to shed that stubborn shell that I developed over time. So I do think a level of rules, and some rules are needed and are good, but it just depends on the context of the rule.
Let me wrap up like this, maybe to help you understand how I see rules working in a Christian life. When I was falling in love with my wife, Kathy, I actually did research. I talked to her friends. I did everything I could to find out what she liked and what she didn't like. And then I did it, or didn't do it. And when I look back on it, that was obviously, I was making all these changes, and people saw that, but it was love, and it didn't even feel like obedience. And if you already love somebody and you feel loved, then you want to please them, and in a sense, you're making changes, but it doesn't even feel like rules. It's just an instrument for pleasing the loved one. Now, that's how it starts. Having been married a long time, I want you to know that as you get out into the middle of marriage and you're limiting yourself, you're trying to please the other person, it gets really hard unless the other person also limits herself, unless she's doing the very, very same thing. And then if you have 30 or 35 years of it, it can be a wonderful, wonderful kind of deep relationship that would never be gotten to otherwise unless you had given up the right to live as you wanted and limited yourself to the other person. I think that's how it works with God, especially when you consider we don't just limit ourselves for God, but God actually made sacrifices for us. Only Christianity says that God became human, he went to the cross. So if I was giving to my wife and she never gave to me, it wouldn't work. If you give to God without having a God who actually has given to you, it wouldn't work. But in the Christian God, you've got somebody like that. You are great conversation partners, and I'm looking forward to the next time, which won't be too long. And thank you very much for being here and participating.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Top objections to Christianity. Welcome to The Reason for God. Welcome back to our fourth session together. We're discussing tonight the topic, why does God allow suffering? Why is there so much evil in the world? This is a big philosophical question for a lot of people. A lot of people believe it really poses a huge barrier to belief in God. It's also, though, a very personal issue. It functions, I think, on two levels. And I don't know anybody who hasn't struggled with the idea emotionally and existentially, how could there be a God if there's all this? However, I think I'd like to start by putting it in a philosophical form, if that's okay. And it goes like this. Here's the difficulty. Given evil and suffering, if God's all-powerful, then he probably doesn't care enough to stop it, so he's not loving. Or if God's all-loving and he wants to stop it, then he must not be all-powerful. But if you have an all-powerful, all-loving God, which is what the Bible says, existing, then there shouldn't be evil. But there is evil, therefore, that God can't exist. So let me just start with that question. Do you think that makes the case? Do you think evil and suffering pretty much disproves the very existence of God? What do you think?
I would pretty much say yes. I think that's a big thing for me, because like you mentioned, if God is omnipotent, if he is all powerful, all ruling, then he either pretty much chooses not to save everyone or eliminate evil, or he can't. And if he chooses not to, he's not benevolent. But if he chooses, or I guess if he chooses not to, he's not I can't, tongue twister. If he chooses not to, he's not benevolent. I can't say that word right now. Anyway, he's not loving.
Yeah.
If he chooses not to, he's not loving. And if he is loving, then he can't save everyone. So it really comes down to that for me.
So you're convinced by that pretty much?
Almost entirely, yeah.
I think at the logical level, the answer is yes, it's a problem. Because Christianity does make, I think, 4 claims which, as a package, are in conflict with each other. It says that God is a personal God who hears petitionary prayer. He is good, and he is omnipotent, and there is evil. And any explanation of evil, at some level, compromises on one of those or more of those 4 things, that he's omnipotent, good, a personal God, and that there is evil. So at a logical level, I think it is a problem.
I think the existence of suffering, it kind of leads to like the 2 least satisfactory explanations for me. One of them is God has a plan and we can't understand the existence of suffering. That's a non-starter for me. You have to do a better job than that. And then the second one is,
try.
Yeah, because there's just like a blanket answer for virtually anything that we can't think through or discuss.
That's fair.
And so it's a very easy crutch, I think. And I think the second one is there is a purpose for your suffering. I think that's also a very unsatisfactory answer, at least for me, because when you see how random the suffering, at least it seems to be, and how our sense of justice doesn't really seem to line up with what we observe. The idea that there might be a purpose, I think it just seems very unfair. There's something like instinctively unfair about that.
The problem is the benevolence claim that Christianity makes at the logical level. I mean, if somebody went around, anyone else went around killing people or maiming them at birth or spreading cancer, you would have said that was a very bad person.
Or even allowing it to exist if they have the power to stop it.
But God does all those things.
Right, that's what I mean.
Exactly.
So I was kind of
So
feeding off
that's-
of what you're saying.
That's the problem with why shouldn't there be suffering. If Christianity didn't make the goodness claim about God, then it would be easier.
And also, what if some people's suffering leads to other people's happiness? You know, like let's say, you know, if it's a divorce in a family, maybe the kids suffer, but maybe it leads to the parents' happiness. So maybe some people need to suffer in order for other people to be happy. And maybe later on in life, coming from like a karma point of view, it'll all lead back to, you know, another reaction that will lead to non-suffering for the other people.
That's my, you know, I always think that these things are personal choices that, you know, I think Buddhists and Hindus both believe that given a specific action, people choose to either see it as a positive or negative, you know, outcome. And I think given sometimes more information, people's perspective on an action changes. That at a local level, personal family member passes away, that's a tragedy, it's personal suffering, but maybe through study of that person's disease, you know. I just want to throw in a personal thing, that today I heard a piece of classical music, Metamorphosen by Richard Strauss, which is written right at the end of the Second World War. And it's this beautiful piece that expresses all this suffering of a, you know, collective group of people, but it's for the bombing of Dresden, for a German city that went down at the end, and nothing about the Jews or the Allies or anything. But it's a beautiful piece of music.
Just two things, two ideas. The only religion that says God actually came into this world and suffered excruciatingly, and identified with us and suffered along with us all the things that we've suffered. One part of the Bible actually says that. See, assuming that Christianity is true for a second, we still don't know what the reason for suffering is. God doesn't tell us. But now we know what the reason for suffering isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love us. And it can't be that he could just snap his fingers and let it all go away and still have us. In other words, if he loves us enough to suffer for us, then he must have a good reason for allowing it to go on. You see, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, if he came down here to suffer for us, I would like to know why he doesn't just stop it. I don't know why he doesn't just stop it, but the coming and suffering, granting them my premise, the coming and suffering means that he must have some good reasons. It can't just be he's remote and doesn't care.
I think those are just powerful premises. If those are true, then obviously I would agree, but it's so tough to know if those premises have any meaning behind them or if they're just ideas.
This idea of a suffering God being unique, I don't think it's unique at all. I think we all suffer, and if God has suffered, then welcome to life.
I feel like we're talking and defining these terms in a Christian context, and I guess within my head, I'm not interfacing with it differently. Because when the question is asked, why does God allow suffering, my first thought is, why not? I mean, you know, coming from sort of maybe a Buddhist and Taoist background, suffering is life. That's a given. So there's no reason to question why it's there or even to extricate it from your life. And that applies to the term evil too. Of course, we've got to understand what we mean by these terms. I think that's a big problem. But if there's evil in the world, in my opinion, there's good in the world. And you can't take one out or the other. It's not possible.
Can you explain like what you believe, like how you believe suffering to be or how significant it is? I guess I'm not really understanding where you're coming from. Yeah.
In terms of suffering, in terms of what it is for me, there's a sort of scientific way also to look at it, although I think it's more Taoist, which is to say that, you know, I think all this suffering, good and evil are words we put to sort of a feeling of, you know, happiness or positivity, something good, you know, concepts. And that's sort of like happens as a result of, you know, it's like if you work hard, then you sort of get a reward of sort of a good feeling, a result of it. And if you don't, then you don't. There's sort of like just a yin-yang. There's sort of a counterbalance of dynamics that go on. And suffering is just sort of something that happens in the world. There's a struggle. Maybe it's a better word to say it. There's struggle. There's work that builds up to a point, and then at some point you take a vacation, or there's some benefit that you get from it. And so there's sort of that kind of notion. That's how I understand suffering a little bit.
So there's nothing inherently positive or negative. It's all in how you react.
Well, if positive means there's sort of a release, you know, there's sort of a benefiting from work or benefiting from discipline, then that would be a general positive thing. But sort of getting into the good and evil world is a little more loaded for me, I guess. And that's why it's a little hard for me to interface with it. As a pastor, when I'm sitting with people who are going through incredible suffering, the idea that if you could see it somehow, this is all part of the way things are, kind of trivializes it. I found, yet I do know plenty of people from a Buddhist point of view, an Eastern point of view, who have handled suffering with Eastern meditation and Eastern perspective. I know that. I do also wonder sometimes whether that trivializes the evil of the evil. For me, the word suffering actually, my immediate jump is sort of to a Buddhist context definition of it, and I'm not clear if that's what is meant here. And evil is a very problematic concept, because I don't know if I actually believe in it necessarily, certainly in a way that I think a Christian would define it. And therefore also, I don't think our intention is to get rid of evil. I think it exists in balance with good, and you sort of resolve, get rid of one, more of the other increases, but it always kind of comes back to a certain balance.
I think as a skeptic, I do not explain the existence of evil and suffering. I think it's something that we have to deal with. I think in our daily lives, the best thing is to actually try and do something about it. And the worst possible thing is to simply be indifferent.
What about like self-imposed suffering? Like that was like one thing that I was thinking of, suffering that's self-imposed, like someone that gets lung cancer because they smoked for 30 years, or someone who, recklessly spends their money and gambles, and then they have to file for bankruptcy. Like suffering that, sometimes you go to the church, but it's obviously self-imposed.
But then it's only self-imposed for you if you're dying of cancer. But your brother, your sister, your parents, for all of them, it's not. So you're part of it. You very often have an active role in some suffering, but most of the suffering is happening to the people around you.
For me, when you listen to somebody who's lived through the Holocaust or what have you, and you listen to their story, and this is a very personal thing, it's like a tear's been made in the fabric of the universe, and there's nothing this side of the tear that can sew it up again.
Let me propose a way to think about this, and tell me what you think. 6 years old. 6-year-olds suffer because they see things happen. Very often they can't understand what their parents are doing, which their parents are disciplining them in some way, or maybe moving them out of town. They never see their friends again. They feel unhappy, inconsolable, filled with grief, and I think they suffer as much as anybody who's as upset as they can be. But we also know by the time they get to be 25 or 30, they look back and they know they really suffered, but now they have a perspective. They realize why some of those things happen. Or even if they were bad things, they get past them because they're able to get a bigger perspective. If there was a God, why couldn't we all be 6 years old spiritually? Or even worse, I mean, the difference between a 6-year-old and a 30-year-old, as different as that is, it'd be far greater to be a human being and then maybe in heaven and seeing things differently. Why couldn't we all be 6 years old? And the reason I'm putting it this way is I don't want to say, oh, I'm sure, I don't see any purpose in this stuff either. I can't even begin to say, I'm sure there's some kind of reason, behind the Holocaust, that God's working some kind of good. So I don't want to try to guess. I think it's awful. I do think it's insulting to guess. And yet at the same time, I wonder whether it's possible we're all 6 years old, and it would be possible to have a perspective on which everything we look at would be like the grief of a 6-year-old. What do you all think of that? I love it, I hate it, I'm never coming back. It helps a little. or some other?
I think it helps because I think the 6-year-old feels suffering because they can't predict the outcome of their actions. They do something and all of a sudden they just realize dad's yelling at them or mom's upset. There's a confusion that happens, but they were simply acting. I think as they get older, they contextualize their actions. I think that's what happens. That's how I see things in general. Things happen and we suffer, I think, and then later we gain understanding about what that suffering was.
I think whenever you're suffering hardship, and I guess I'll make it personal. I grew up in a very Christian family. My parents are still very Christian, and so if they see that I'm struggling with something or there are challenges in my life, they explain it by saying there's a greater purpose. And yeah, there might be, but I find that to be a very limited explanation. It doesn't really comfort me, especially because what you want at that moment is alleviation. You don't want some grand explanation of why this is happening to you.
Another thing I do sometimes, which probably isn't the best way of handling things, is just to sweep it under the rug and just try and forget about it. Just cross it out of my mind and pretend it never happened. And that's one way that I can usually deal with suffering.
There was a guy named Horatio Spafford, 1870s. All 4 of his little girls died in a boating accident. It was an ocean liner. 1873 goes down. So it's all of his children. He writes a hymn called It Is Well With My Soul. I don't know if any of you have ever heard it. And it's all about the cross and about Jesus. And what's intriguing to me is you'd think that he would work through his grief, and it was very, very helpful to him. It really helped him through. But it's all about Jesus dying on the cross. And I used to wrestle with why in the world would this have helped him? It's all about Jesus. But I realized 2 things that happen when you suffer. One is sometimes you think, I'm being punished. But the cross says, no, Jesus took your punishment if granting the premise. The second question comes up, well, maybe God doesn't care. But the cross says God does care. In fact, he's lost a child out of his love for you. I mean, that's, again, granting the premise. So here's a guy who had real suffering. And the idea that God comes into the world in Jesus Christ and suffers even though he doesn't give you the answers, but that proves that he loves us, it's pretty functional.
Which brings us to, the comforting aspect and how people turn to God in a time of suffering. And you mentioned the story about the daughters and everything, and the man finding strength from God. And it really comes down to, is it really just a magnificent and wonderful coping mechanism? Is it this thing that people find strength in and find love in times of, great sadness? I'm not saying I'm against it, or I'm not saying I support it. I'm saying it works. And I'm not sure if it works because it's real or because it works.
If we're putting the lens of is Christianity a coping mechanism, my question here is what isn't a coping mechanism ultimately? Because, it's a coping mechanism because we believe it's maybe not true and we're using these stories to help us get through the day. But, as a science person, who, understood the history of Newtonian physics was disproved in some ways. It only works within certain contexts. It was technically a coping mechanism until we figured out, stuff Einstein brought in and stuff that is in quantum level. So I don't know. I feel like in many ways, not to trivialize it, what isn't technically a coping mechanism?
How did I feel about a suffering God in Christianity? It actually made me think that it is a unique aspect of Christianity. From what I know about all the other religions I've studied, it seems that is something that is unique. And I actually felt it might be a useful thing to help somebody get through a tragedy. It seemed like we need that. We need to feel that there are people or there is a force or some being that can empathize and go through these things with us. I think that that's something I realized in my own life. And it seems like if Christianity can offer that, that might be a useful thing to think about.
I think I need to wrap up. Let me give you a poem that vividly gets across the distinctive way in which Christianity can give you a handle on evil and suffering. It's by, I hope I can remember it, but it's only the last stanza. It's by a man named Edward Shillito, and it goes like this. The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to thy throne. To our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And no God has wounds but thou alone. That's getting across the idea that Jesus on the cross is a God with wounds, and there's really nothing that speaks to my wounds over the years as much as God's wounds has. So thank you for coming. You gave me lots to think about. I hope I gave you a lot to think about. And thanks for being here, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome to our 5th session. Glad you're here. And our topic for tonight is, why is the church responsible for so much injustice? Why are Christians such hypocrites? Somebody put it to me this way, actually several people. They've said, even if Christianity is so great, why is there so much injustice and hypocrisy? Not only in the institutional church historically, but even in Christians that I have met or I see. So they can't identify with Christianity either as an institution or Christian individuals because of what they see as apparent injustice and hypocrisy in the track record of Christians in the church. To what degree do you feel that way too? What has your experience been? Let's go.
So for me, I want to answer the second question by asking a question in terms of why are Christians such hypocrites? What are some common hypocrisies that Christians that you're aware of are accused of?
You're asking me to give you ammunition?
Ammo, I'm just, as someone who, I just think people who have publicly stated values, ethics, morals are more likely to be subject to the claims of being a hypocrite because they actually put out there a standard by which they live by, so they're more likely to. So
yes.
I think this is the case for any individual who might make public a degree of what their stances are, because it's very hard to hold those. But I'm just curious, what are some common ones that you're aware of that Christians are sort of accused of?
I would still rather collect examples, but to me, a hypocrite is an inconsistent person. A person that says one thing, does another, and kind of knows that they're doing something wrong, but puts up a front.
Okay.
I think most of us. Do we agree on that? That would be what a hypocrite is?
Yes.
So, but I would be happy to have some of you answer Eddie's question.
Yeah, I would think that popes who preach about chastity and about premarital sex, who then have children out of wedlock with nuns, are examples of hypocrites.
Yeah, I would agree. I think everybody would.
Well, it's across the board. I think in every aspect of human endeavors, you're going to find people who transgress some kind of norm. I think it's within our psychological makeup to not always follow the rules, to choose paths outside of what might be generally accepted.
The church being responsible for many injustices, I rather feel that there is a case here. The list is almost, one doesn't know where to begin.
Yeah, I feel like it's not, I wouldn't say that I'm judging the church or Christians for being hypocritical or for producing more injustice than other institutions. Most institutions have produced injustice, or certainly most institutions that have some power in the world have created injustice at some point. But if you are going to make a moral claim, if you are going to, in some sense, say we are special in some sense, then by your own terms, the temptation is to judge you by your own terms, basically.
I think the objectionable Christians that I've seen, I don't know, maybe they are loving the Lord. I have no idea what what they do on Sundays or any other day. But I think the part that I see being really problematic is the love your neighbor part. I see them being judgmental. I see them being extremely self-righteous, and I see them holding people that they deem to be sinners to a different standard than they would themselves, and I find that to be extremely problematic.
What I'm wondering is that a hypocrisy unique to Christianity, or is there some track record of that also in religions that also have strict rules along with it?
I think it's not unique to Christianity. Right. I read a book by a Jewish rabbi who said that his synagogue is full of sinners, just the way that hospitals are full of sick people. I know that's the classic example, but I think it applies to every religion.
what do you think of Liz's comeback that says, all right, of course, believers aren't perfect. Just like a hospital is a place where you find sick people, not well people, why wouldn't a church be a place where you'd find inconsistent, broken people who don't always get it right? Isn't that what church is for? So why look into that church and see inconsistent people and say, aha, hypocrite, when that's what a church is for?
If we go the hospital for sinners route, we have to distinguish between the doctors and the patients. The patients, a patient who walks around with tuberculosis and infects people for 3 weeks, we kind of understand he doesn't understand what tuberculosis is. If a doctor has tuberculosis, we expect him to recognize it in himself.
Stay home.
And stay home and not infect, cough and splutter over everybody. So I think you hold the clergy to a higher standard.
What do some of the rest of you think about the hospital for sinners idea?
I don't think it's the existence of, people who commit sin or patients in a hospital that's problematic, at least personally for me. I think it's when people who are Christians or claim to be Christians or have some level of moral authority don't admit that they're fallible, and so they cast their judgment outward. And I think that sort of inability to admit fault, and also the sort of this really quick kind of knee-jerk reaction to judge others, I think those are really big problems for me.
Yes. Here's one response. Both, especially in the Old Testament and actually, especially in the New Testament with Jesus, there are internal self-critiques by the believing community on what they would call religious hypocrisy, or in the New Testament, Phariseeism. And the difference between a Pharisee in the New Testament and a Christ follower is not that the Pharisee and the Christian aren't both trying to obey God. They actually are. In fact, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount contrasts a Pharisee with his own followers. And he says, you're both giving to the poor, you're both praying, you're both trying to obey God, but one of you is doing it not only self-righteously and feeling superior to other people, but when you do wrong, you won't admit it. And so there's not this theme of humble repentance in your life. And in the Old Testament, the same kind of critique happened. Martin Luther, by the way, had the first of his 95 Theses that he nailed to the Wittenberg door was all of life is repentance, which he thought that true biblical Christianity was not, I'm going to really summons up the blood and live a good life and then God will bless me. He actually said, the beginning of Christianity is to admit, to repent, and to admit I haven't done it right, and to rely on God for His grace. And that changes my attitude toward other people. I can never feel superior to them. I sense, though, God's love in my life, so I'm not defensive anymore. It should change everything. I think what Eunice said is extremely telling, that when you see that you have a lack of ability on the part of an institution to do repentance, admit what was wrong, and they continue to condemn over here, and yet they won't admit themselves, that they're not being too Christian, they're being less Christian than they should be. They're not using a critique that the Bible actually gives them. So they deserve to be faulted the way you've faulted them.
I don't know. I think, yeah, there's probably a lot of hypocrisy in Christianity. There's probably a lot of injustice, but it's no different than it might be for any organized religion or big organization.
I don't feel strongly about the objection to hypocrisy in Christianity because I think there is hypocrisy in every religion.
As regards the question about are Christians sometimes hypocrites, I don't think I have a lot to say about that one, because I think that's saying, do people sometimes not live up to their own standards? That's absolutely true.
I tend to be very understanding of hypocritical organizations, because I think hypocritical organizations are made out of people, and people are good and bad.
My feeling on the injustice and hypocrisy in the church is that it's part of human nature. Every structure that humans build, there's going to be that involved. There's just no way around it.
Let me offer you a perspective on the charge of hypocrisy, that many Christians are inconsistent in the way in which they behave and act. Some years ago, I took a course on ethnography, and somebody told me that ethnography was a new development in anthropology some years ago, in which the anthropologists for years had been looking at these strange people groups from the outside. Ethnography was understanding a people group from the participant's eye view, as much as possible to understand, not impose our values and listen to them. Sometimes when people say, I see these Christians and they're such hypocrites, they're coarse, they're overzealous, they tend to be, they're too critical, they're kind of inconsistent. There's a tendency from the outside to say, if you believe you know God, which is what Christians say, then you ought to be really good people. From the inside, the gospel is Christians are people who admit that they're not good, that they are essentially morally very weak and failed, and need God's grace. Would that help you at all? Understand why some people that might look like hypocrites from the outside might not actually be hypocrites?
Well, I also, I understand and am sympathetic with the idea that it's sort of the effort to be good, or the ideal to be good, that somebody's working towards it in some sense, working towards sort of living up to their ideals, and that should be part of any judgment you do or don't do for them. So I think it's very interesting. It's one of the most difficult things I think in human relations. Do you judge somebody by what they've done, or by what they're trying to do, basically?
Well, isn't the problem really that it's a question of self-assessment and objective assessment, that I could have all these terrible qualities that Eunice is saying, but I could claim myself to be a Christian, where there's not an objective test, whereas if there's someone of us fell sick in here and someone said, well, I'm a board-certified doctor, I can help this person, we of course would let that happen. But in maybe what's happening is that there's no one, I could just say, I'm a Christian, and exhibit no qualities of the good things we're talking about, or I could be someone who exhibits all these great qualities and say, in no way am I Christian. I mean, maybe that's the tougher point.
And that would align with the ethno perspective that you're talking about, right? That, I think what Menon brought out was the non-Christian viewpoint of it. But what Menon said, I would say to me and maybe non-Christians, it would make sense. Like, I don't know, I'm making the point. I'm trying to, I thought your point was really compelling. It actually struck me, trying to put yourself in the shoes of the person rather than interpret their actions through your own lens.
I think my view of Christianity changes with every book I read, with every conversation I have. Yes, absolutely. If somebody says their view doesn't change, then I wonder if they're listening.
What I've probably come to learn is that I can have an intelligent conversation with someone who's a Christian and not feel that there's an impasse.
I do think admitting your weakness and admitting your faults, and I mean that on an individual level and an institutional level, I wish we could see more of that from Christians and the church.
I admire many Christians. In fact, I admire Christian values a lot. I think I've met personally Christians who are very committed to doing good in the world, who are very open, who are very sincere, who are very humble, and I admire them a lot. And I think for them, their Christianity helps them in that effort. I certainly think that in history, everyone, from Martin Luther King to many people who helped in injustice around the world. There are many Christians who have done wonderful things.
So let me leave you with this thought. When Martin Luther King Jr. was confronting racism in the South, supported by white churches, he didn't say to them, in order to get justice, you need to hold your Christian beliefs less tightly, or you need to come to see the truth is relative. Instead, he called them to truer and deeper Christian faith. He invoked the Bible, and he pointed out that Jesus himself was a victim of injustice, yet he died forgiving his enemies, and that nonviolent resistance to injustice was the very basis of Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement. And therefore, we must never condone or excuse injustice and oppression that the church has done. I just want to point out that when the church does it, it's acting inconsistently, I think. So I'm leaving with that thought to wrap up. You've been great again, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, 3 sessions 3 more conversations, 3 more skeptical perspectives. I ask you again, what are you picking up? What would you say, personally, you're taking away from this time? Let me ask you this, without getting into the details of what was covered in the 3 things. Do you understand the goal of becoming ethnological missionaries? Right? He talks about ethnology and says that's the study of seeing things from within a context or a culture. My prayer is that you see here that that's exactly what we're trying to do. Is rather than speak at, it's to understand and relate from within. And to do that requires from the missionary a commitment to ministry and missional living. Again, I don't want you to look for the silver bullet. I'm praying that you're being soaked in a context that will have an effect on you. Let's take one more 10-minute break. We'll come back to one more 15-minute session. I'll bring it all together with some more observation, and I'm going to send you away with 10 principles that I pray in this context will change forevermore how you see your call to be a witness, using words that witness in a walk that worships. Let's go ahead and get back together in 10 minutes. We'll start, let's say, at 7:15. All right, thanks.